Good evening, everyone. My name's Alex Nestor. I am an investigative fellow at Parents Defending Education. And tonight we're going to be talking all about what happened in state houses across the country this year, what states did to secure parental rights, defend women's sports, and remove critical race theory from the classroom. Joining me tonight, we have Kim Richey, a distinguished fellow at Parents Defending Education. We have John Ketcham, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and Jonathan Butcher, the Will Skillman Fellow in Education at the Heritage Foundation. Guys, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
First is going to Kim. Let's set the stage. What is it that we're actually talking about here? For those who don't necessarily remember Schoolhouse Rock, how are laws made? How is the state process different from the process at the federal level?
Yeah, Alex. Well, it's a great question. I would say that state processes are, in general, quite similar to the federal process employed by Congress. Although, of course, even within various states, how a bill becomes a law varies quite a bit by state. Each state has their own process. They have rules that govern how a bill actually becomes a law. And so different states have different processes in place. And so, in general, I think it's very important that parents and those who want to get involved really become familiar with how their specific process works in their respective states. I can tell you in general that when someone wants to pass a bill within a certain state, it is a member of the legislature, either a senator or a representative or a delegate, and they propose a bill, they draft a bill, and they file it. Once the bill is filed, it is read within the particular house of origin, whether it be a House of Representatives or whether it be a Senate. And after that first reading, it is typically assigned to a committee or maybe even to a number of committees. But it is assigned to a committee and it is heard and considered by that committee. So the committee will have a hearing. In some states, the public can participate in that committee hearing process and they can actually provide input on a particular bill. But several things can happen in that committee hearing. The bill it's debated. The author provides information. Other members of the legislature can ask questions. But the bill either passes committee, it fails committee, it can be amended, or even a committee substitute can be presented, which of course means that a whole new bill can sometimes be presented. If the bill dies in committee, then it is dead. But if it passes, it moves on to the House of Origin, where it's considered by the full body. It's heard on the floor of the body. Again, it's presented by the author of the legislation. Other members of the legislature get to ask questions. They debate whether the bill should be passed. It can also be amended on the floor. So it really is an evolving process. If that bill passes one house, the House of Origin, it is referred to the other house in the legislature, to the alternate house. Once it's read there, the same process occurs. It's assigned to a committee. It's voted on and considered by the committee. If it passes, of course, it can still be amended. It can still be substituted in the alternate house. But if it passes, it goes to the alternate house for a full vote. Anything can happen there, of course. More amendments can take place. More substitutes can often occur. If the second body, if the alternate house passes a different version of the bill, sometimes a conference committee will be appointed so that the two houses can agree on what the bill is going to look like. But at the end of the day, whatever version is considered, both houses have to agree on what that bill is going to look like. So whether that's through a conference committee or whether they have to reconsider the bill a second time, maybe it goes back to the original House of Origin. Whatever happens in your state, that both legislative bodies have to approve of that bill. Once that happens, it often goes to the governor. The governor likely has a specific period of time where he or she considers that bill that did pass the legislature. And then, of course, if the governor vetoes that bill, most states have a process for overriding a governor's veto. So it is a very lengthy process. It usually takes 5 to 6 months. And of course, as I mentioned, this process varies state by state, and it's just very important to to really get to know the legislative process within your state. As far as how state processes compare with federal, as I mentioned, the process is quite similar. The House and the Senate have to agree on a final bill. All in all, I would say, and I've handled legislation both at the federal and the state level. I would say all in all, navigating through state houses, getting bills passed at the state level, that process, in my experience, is just easier to navigate. I think that members are more accessible. There's more of an opportunity to get things done. You can engage more directly with state legislators and with committee members. And, I think there is much more of an opportunity to be directly involved in the process, which I think is very important, especially for parents that we work with at PDE. So I think what that means is that there's much more of an opportunity at the state level to get really good education policies passed. And I think that, I think that's certainly reflected in our conversation today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kim. That's a great stage for us. Gentlemen, anything else when it comes to, passing bills at the state level, the ins and outs of how that works?
Well, no matter where you live, it's important that you vote in your state and local elections. Oftentimes, national elections gets all the attention, but local legislative races can be won or lost on the basis of a few hundred votes. So your vote tends to go farther in state and local races. And school board elections in particular are often held on off-cycle years or on the odd-numbered years in between federal election years. So that tends to empower special interests and teachers unions in particular. It's important for parents to know when the election is happening and to make their voices heard at the ballot box.
Yeah, those are all great points. The only thing that I would just emphasize, one of the things that Kimberly said, and that is that public comment is usually taken at the committee level. So when a bill is really first introduced, the chance that you would have as a parent, as a taxpayer, as a voter, to comment on a piece of legislation usually happens when the bill is presented and heard in committee. And I think hopefully Kimberly would agree here that lawmakers do like to hear from constituents. They do like it when parents come to a committee hearing and show that they have read a piece of legislation and then make a comment about how that may affect them and how they feel about that. So that particular part of the process, when it goes into a committee before it's heard for a big vote on the floor and all of that, is just a really critical point for voters, for parents to become engaged.
Yeah, Jonathan, I think you're absolutely correct. And actually your comment, Jonathan, made me think of something else. For parents who want to get involved, in their state legislature and who want to see certain bills get passed, I think it's really important to remember that by the time legislative session starts, everybody's bills have already been drafted, they've already been filed, they've already received numbers. So if you're a parent who is wanting to get involved, it's important to get in touch with your representative or with your senator or with your delegate in that off season, and reach out, request to meet with them, tell them, ask them to sponsor, whatever type of legislation you want to see. But that all occurs when the legislature is out of session, right? So it really is it really is a 365 day a year job, because this is always ongoing, and it's there's always something going on at the legislature, and so it's even more important to get plugged in when the legislature is not in session, or at least just as is important for when they are in session.
Absolutely. And parents, you should know too, every state has a website that has the entire catalog of all of the bills that have been introduced in that session and prior sessions. So go do your research, spend some time on that, and go look at what's going on in your state house. Jonathan, the next question is for you. You say all of these laws that are defending education fall under the umbrella of quote unquote the Parental Bill of Rights. What do you mean by that? And can you give us a few examples of how that played out in state houses in 2022?
Sure. And I think the Parent Bill of Rights that probably caught the most attention in the past legislative session came out of Florida. It was called the, quote, "Don't Say Gay" bill by opponents, but all that demonstrated was that they hadn't read the actual piece of legislation. I mean, what was in this Parent Bill of Rights was a requirement that schools receive permission from parents before they do certain activities with a child, and that it prevented students from being exposed to material that is not age appropriate at certain levels. So it said that from K to 3, for example, students couldn't be exposed to ideas that were talking about gender, ideas that were talking about these pretty ambiguous ideas of choosing how your sexuality is expressed in school, right? So the Parent Bill of Rights that attracted the most attention came out of Florida. Florida's was not the first, though. In fact, it wasn't even the first in Florida. Just to give you a lay of the land, parent bills of rights have been considered around the country for many, many years, especially over the past decade. They usually are pretty short. They're short provisions that would say something to the effect of parents have the authority to be in charge of their child's upbringing, including their moral and religious education. Now, over the past 2 years in particular, lawmakers have begun to expand these ideas and add other concepts to it because parents have complained and said that their children have been either exposed to content regarding gender ideology that they believed is either inappropriate or certainly age inappropriate. There's been this question of how this idea of critical race theory, which is a discriminatory theory that originated in Marxism about 100 years ago, is being not just taught in schools, but actually applied. And students are being asked to affirm this idea that discrimination is appropriate in schools. And we're happy to provide examples of that a little later. So Florida's bill was the first to sort of be the second wave of parent bills of rights that were considered, and then in Florida's case, adopted. Other states that were important in this movement in the past year included Indiana. Now, Indiana did not adopt a parent bill of rights, but their attorney general has written a guidebook that explains what provisions would be important in a parent bill of rights, including the idea that schools must get permission from parents before any health-related activity is conducted with or for a child. And that should include counseling services. It certainly includes any medication that would be administered to a child. And taking this one step further, today, we have these policies in states such as New Jersey and Kansas that say that teachers are not allowed to tell parents when a child comes to school and wants to assume a different identity, a different gender identity. And this is radical because not only are you hiding information from parents about their children, not only is this medical information that matters greatly to a family, but also because once a child starts down the path, a minor child starts down the path of looking to assume a different gender, it is a very short step before they are consulting with either counselors or even medical professionals to take medication that would stall or block puberty, which can lead even further, perhaps even to surgeries that would then alter a child permanently when it comes to their gender. So these are big issues that schools are taking on and even preventing, in some cases, parents from being a part of that process. Hence the title. That's why we call these parent bills of rights. So Florida's passage this past year was very important and really, I believe, set a model in a couple of key ways for the country. Indiana has a guidebook that is very valuable for lawmakers all over the US as they consider what should be included in a parent bill of rights. In Kansas, lawmakers in the House and Senate adopted a parent bill of rights, but it was vetoed by the governor, so did not become law. But this provision, this particular example is important because it included several items all together. It said not only that parents have the ultimate responsibility for the upbringing of their children, it also said that schools must receive express permission from parents before any health activity is conducted with a child. But it also said that no individual should be compelled to affirm or believe any idea that would violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is how it brushes up with this term that's in the news so much today of critical race theory. This theory argues not only as our government is systemically racist today, it actually argues that discrimination is not only appropriate, but necessary. It is hearkening back to a period before even the civil rights movement. There are applications of critical race theory that actually do violate federal law, not only the consciences and the morals that we hold so dear as a part of our American identity. So with the success in Florida, with, I think, the leading edge of these ideas from Indiana and Kansas, we should keep a lookout for what's going to happen in Texas next year. The governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, has indicated that it is important for him to see a parent bill of rights become a reality for parents and families in his state. And these are all things that parents should sort of have on the lookout. Georgia adopted a similar provision in this past legislative session as well. South Carolina also came close. So this is clearly something that's on the mind of lawmakers.
Absolutely. Jonathan, can you maybe give us like 3 or 4 points? What's usually included in these bills? Like, prohibitions against compelled speech. What's the type of language when they actually ban critical race theory? Can you maybe just give us a couple points there?
Certainly. And we at the Heritage Foundation wrote a brief paper about this a couple of weeks ago that outlines really 4 big points. I mean, one is this reaffirmation that parents are the primary caregivers of their children and are responsible for their moral and religious upbringing. The second is this issue of health and how schools must receive express permission from parents before having any sort of health activity, whether it's just counseling or whether it's actually medication that's administered to a child, anything from cough syrup to perhaps something even more aggressive or that has even more lasting effects on a child. The third would be academic transparency. I think it's important in either rights or as a part of a movement that of several bills that deal with a parent bill of rights is to say that schools must provide access to voters and parents to a school curriculum. They should be able to go online through Schoology, Blackboard, Canvas, whatever sort of program your district is using, and see what is the syllabus, what is the reading list, what are the handouts, what are the assignments that are given to students. We're not asking, it's not appropriate to say, oh, well, we should take a textbook and put the whole thing online for everyone to read and see, right? That's not what's being asked. What is being asked is that what the instructional content that is being given to students should be accessible to families so they don't have to read about it in the paper the next day about some sort of radical idea that was taught. And then the fourth and final thing, and this is a part of some model legislation that Heritage has put together, is this idea that no individual should be required, so no teacher or student should be forced to believe an idea that would violate the Civil Rights Act. They should not be forced to believe that certain individuals are oppressive just by the color of their skin, or have certain privileges that would make them oppressive even if they didn't know it based on the color of their skin. And I'll finish with this, Alex. So these are not exaggerations. There are examples in school curriculum and content that we can point to that teaches these very things and that asks students to affirm these very ideas. So hence, that's why this language is so carefully tailored and why it's so important.
Absolutely. John, you're next. Quite a number of states passed anti-CRT bills to combat critical race theory, wokeness in the classroom. I'm curious, what are some of the best laws that were passed in the states? What's the language included there?
Sure, thanks, Alex. So, legislation regulating CRT in K-12 public schools comes under a couple different varieties. The first type to emerge in response to woke ideology and CRT in 2020 and 21 tried to limit or even ban divisive concepts. And Jonathan just mentioned several of them, such as the United States is a fundamentally and irredeemably racist country. And during the 21-22 legislative session, Governor Youngkin's executive order in Virginia and the Stop Woke Act in Florida were examples of this type of legislation seeking to limit curricular instruction about these topics. But there are a few issues in trying to limit or outright ban CRT in classrooms. Teachers can get around these bans by being creative. They can simply put an objective gloss over these lessons, and that would be acceptable under many of these laws, so long as they are taught in an objective manner without endorsement. So teachers who believe in these concepts can find ways around them. And it also opens the door for progressives to get a hold of the legislature and limit curricular content that conservatives might find appealing. So given those downsides, some states have instead decided to protect students from government-compelled speech, typically requiring that no government actor force a student to affirm, believe, or otherwise support in any way any number of the aforementioned divisive concepts that Jonathan also mentioned. So this goes back to a case in the Supreme Court from the early 1940s called Barnett, in which the court held that K-12 public school students had First Amendment rights to be protected against government-compelled speech. And states can also enshrine that same protection in state legislation. So Mississippi's SB 2113 did that this term, and Kansas's Parental Bill of Rights had language to that effect as well, as Jonathan mentioned. The other way that legislation seeks to rein in CRT is by providing parents more information about what their kids are learning in the classroom, curriculum transparency. And so it doesn't seek to limit or ban any particular substance. It basically uses the unpopularity of CRT and divisive concepts against it. And some bills that were passed this year take a reactionary approach to transparency. They require that parents take the first step in requesting curricular materials from teachers and schools. Louisiana's HB 369 is an example of this. It requires that the schools simply post the method that parents would use to request curricular materials. What we at the Manhattan Institute and other groups have instead recommended as the better policy is better understood as a proactive model of transparency, whereby parents would get ahead of time before they make decisions about their kids' school. For instance, all the materials that the school would intend to teach in that, let's say, quarter or year or however long. Now, broadening this out is essentially makes transparency a anodyne, politically neutral, and broadly appealing principle. And therefore, transparency is, to my mind, the best approach. It allows parents to get more engaged in their kids' education, which studies show consistently raises academic outcomes. It lets teachers look to the examples of high-performing schools and high-performing teachers so that they don't have to spend hours every week scouring the web for more curricular materials. And some of the legislation passed along these veins. This session was in Arizona, although it didn't actually get the governor's signature, and in West Virginia, which allows schools to post all the materials on class syllabi.
That's great. That's great, John. Thank you for that. And I do think, transparency, as I was looking at the bills myself, that does seem like a really great way forward, in the sense, that you said, who couldn't get behind wanting to, actually show parents and give parents access to what their kids are learning. I do agree with you. I think that's a great way forward here. Jonathan, you brought up earlier, I'm going to pose this question to Kim, but Jonathan, you had mentioned earlier the issues of sex and gender and sexuality that we're seeing arise even in elementary school classrooms. This is a huge topic, a huge discussion at school board meetings and in state houses. So, Kim, what laws were passed regarding things like sexuality and sexually explicit material and gender identity?
Yeah. So, I would say yes on both fronts, right, Alex? I mean, we saw a number of bills across the state, even or across the country that deal with both of those issues, right? There was clearly interest from state legislatures in trying to pass laws that govern some obscene material in classes, but also quite a few bills that are aimed at putting into place guidelines for how schools consider gender identity. Let me start first with kind of sexually explicit material in classrooms, because I know that's something that we at PDE have for months, heard from parents about concerns, either sexually explicit or obscene material being used in a classroom, or even students just having access to that kind of material, either in the library or in some other type of educational program. So there were a number of bills filed across the country, and I'm sure some parents even heard about bills that would be considered just flat out bans of this type of material. A lot of those bills did not pass. So there was not, those bills just did not tend to make it out of state legislatures. But in a few states, they did find kind of more creative and innovative ways at kind of targeting that information that would be harmful to minors. Georgia comes to mind. Georgia passed Senate Bill 226 that essentially creates a new statutory definition of material that would be harmful to minors and set specific types of restrictions in place. I think what was interesting about the Georgia bill is that it included a complaint process that I think really empowers parents. So the law requires every school district in Georgia to adopt a complaint resolution policy so that parents and legal guardians who believe that their children that their minor children have been subject to harmful or obscene material can actually file complaints with the local school district. Under the law, the principal or the designee of the school is required to take reasonable steps to investigate allegations within 7 days of a parent filing a complaint. And they must get back to the parent within 10 calendar days, informing the parent about whether the material was deemed harmful or whether it was not. The bill also includes somewhat of an appeal process to the local school board that includes the opportunity to address school board members in a public meeting. And in those situations where a parent does appeal, the local school board has to reach a conclusion within 30 days. So that was really an interesting approach. And I think certainly an approach that gives parents an actual tool for monitoring the use of what they may consider to be harmful information or harmful materials to minors. One other kind of interesting approach, and again, we hear from parents across the country all the time on this front as well. But we've also received a lot of complaints about children being able to access obscene material online through online types of providers and such. Tennessee passed a law this year that focuses a lot on online content. It includes different contractual requirements for providers of digital and online resources for schools, and requires them to have safeguards in place to ensure that minors are not able to access harmful information. It requires those providers to immediately remove harmful material when requested by a local school district. And that bill also included an option for students and parents to be able to file complaints if they feel like their child was subject to harmful materials online. So again, the other issue that was prevalent across the country was bills aimed at instituting some guidelines for how schools consider gender identity. Jonathan already mentioned House Bill 1557 in Florida, which of course was Florida's parental rights law. That is certainly the bill that received the most attention. Although that bill did include several other provisions that also empower parents. In addition to parents' bills of rights that Jonathan discussed, right, which actually get at classroom instruction on gender identity issues, we did see a lot of other types of bills aimed at addressing gender identity in schools. A few states, including Alabama, passed bills that would actually regulate the types of medical treatment that transgender minors can receive. I'm sure parents have heard of Alabama's law, which was Senate Bill 184, which actually made it a felony for any person to engage in or cause certain types of medical care for transgender minors. That bill essentially prohibits gender affirming types of procedures and medical treatment to minor children. What's interesting about that law is that section, which makes it a felony, actually applies to agents, officials, and contractors of school districts. And so the provisions of that bill would certainly impact what we see going on in schools. The other part of Alabama's bill, specifically with regard to schools, placed specific restrictions on nurses, school counselors, teachers, and principals, and prohibits them from encouraging or even coercing minors to withhold information about gender identity from parents. And it also placed restrictions on those school officials so that those school officials cannot withhold that information from parents. Not surprisingly, once this law was signed, the Department of Justice, the Biden administration, is challenging this law on constitutional grounds, but there are a few other states that have enacted similar laws. I would say by far the type of law that was most prevalent in this legislative session were laws that were aimed at protecting women's sports. So most of our parents will know that that the Biden administration, the Biden administration's enforcement of Title IX requires schools to allow transgender students to participate in sports and to access intimate facilities that align with their gender identity. Just this year alone, there were 9 states that passed versions of protecting women's sports laws that actually say, you know what, sex is going to be based on biological sex, and for sports purposes, both at the K-12 and at the higher ed level, only biological females will be able to participate in women's sports. Tennessee passed a law that says that schools actually lose funding if they violate that policy. So there were some other bathroom bills attempting to get at the use of intimate facilities based on gender identity, but certainly a lot of movement across the country on this front.
Absolutely. So to recap, three big things here, right? We have sexually explicit materials in school. We have gender identity issues, schools allowing children to socially transition, which, just to define that for parents, means often using a different name and different pronouns at school. And then, of course, finally, we have the Title IX, women's sports and women's spaces related issues. So 3 whole issues that could probably each, deserve their own live stream.
Yeah,
of course. But gentlemen, anything to add on that front?
Well, I would just say that I think when it comes to the way that lawmakers have responded to these issues, this topic of actually banning content, particularly when it comes to race, I think that you have to tread very, very carefully. I mean, I am in a full agreement with John about how it's this idea that we can sort of ban manipulate how teachers, what they talk about and what they include. But that's why when we talk about the compelled speech issue and the academic transparency, that they go together so well, because ideas and practices such as mandatory racial affinity groups, those actually likely violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? There are applied mechanisms of critical race theory that likely violate federal law. So it's not just, when we say anti-CRT bills, we're not just saying, well, we're going to limit the things that teachers can do in the classroom. What we're really saying is, if there are practices that treat people differently according to their ethnicity or country of origin, that those are violative of existing federal law.
I'd just add that issues regarding children's health don't implicate the strict public school, private school distinction that often appears in curriculum transparency and other curriculum-related legislation. So most of the time, curriculum legislation only relates to K-12 public schools, but it really doesn't matter where you send your kid to school. You should have, as a parent, the right to direct your child's health care. And therefore, many of the bills related to parental oversight of kids' health also regulate private schools for that very reason. And in my mind, they're justified in doing so.
Absolutely. All right. This is a lot of great information so far, you guys. So thank you so much. A couple final questions to round us out. What were good laws passed this year on the school choice area? Jonathan, I know there's a law in West Virginia, and there was an educational savings account, or ESA, bill in South Carolina. Could you tell us more about those?
Sure. Well, there was a lot of activity in West Virginia and Arizona over the past 2 years. So last year, West Virginia adopted a provision that allowed children to access education savings accounts in that state. They became one of the most recent states to adopt an education savings account. There are about 10 in the US today that allow families to access an education savings account for their child. With an account, a parent has access to their child's portion of the funding formula to purchase education products and services. So they have a bank style account that they can use to pay for a personal tutor, education therapy, buy textbooks, pay private school tuition, access schools online, and even in some states access public school services such as an individual class or extracurricular activities. So you're actually allowing families to customize their child's learning experience. The first such law passed in Arizona in 2011. So fast forward to last year, West Virginia adopted a very expansive provision that allowed nearly all children in the state to apply for an education savings account. So this year, Arizona one-upped them and expanded their law. Just a week ago, the governor signed this law saying that all children in the state of Arizona are eligible to apply for an education savings account. Now, that's the good news. The bad news, and what we need to keep our eye on, is that there are legal challenges from the establishment, from teacher unions, not surprisingly, to both of these provisions. So we are likely going to see some challenges, some litigation, or at least in the case of Arizona, there's going to be a broad and ongoing discussion about whether or not this will go on the ballot for voters to actually reject. So we should keep an eye on that. And very quickly, one other thing I didn't want to miss is that West Virginia also adopted a law this past year that added learning pods and micro schools to the school code. And so for those who remember learning pods from the pandemic, parents were forming small groups where they could educate their children, choosing the curriculum, sometimes hiring a teacher to teach 5 to 10 groups of students, about 5 to 10 students at a time. And so West Virginia added this to the law to protect it from the regulations that regulators wanted to add. So I would say those expansions to education savings accounts, as well as the learning pod law, were important breakthroughs this year.
Absolutely. We've talked about Florida's parental rights bill, and I almost said don't say gay bill, just bringing it up in this conversation. The left is so good at messaging these things. And, I was kind of wondering myself as that bill, as we saw it in the media more and more, how can we sort of get ahead of the messaging on some of these bills and focus more on the parental rights aspect of, what's being passed in state houses?
Well, I'll take that one. I think it's for me. So, I think that understanding what is in the provisions, and that's why when Kimberly was talking earlier in our discussion today, it's important to know that you can get involved with the legislature even if they are not meeting, that in order to give testimony, you have to, the best time, the only time usually to do it is when the bills are up for consideration in committee. And I also think that when you read in the media about a particular piece of legislation and there's some sort of, term that the media is giving it, such as the Don't Say Gay bill, or when it comes to school choice, they'll say this bill robs public schools of their money, or this bill will close public schools, things like that, that they're giving it a spin, right? They're giving it something that is probably leaving out a very important piece of information about what these provisions are actually doing. So I think that's why groups such as Parents Defending Ed, such as the Heritage Foundation, the Manhattan Institute, and others do work so hard to explain what is actually going on in these key, frankly, breakthroughs of personal liberty and education freedom.
Absolutely. So a few states have banned biological men from competing in women's sports, as we've discussed. Now, the Biden administration is trying to undo that with their proposed Title IX legislation, or, Title IX rules. So who do schools follow now? Now that the rules are proposed, where are they, and who do school administrators listen to at this point? Kim, I think you might have a really good answer to this.
Well, I don't know if I have a good answer. It's a difficult situation, I think, for both parents and schools, to be honest. But yes, you are right. So just yesterday on July 12th, the Biden administration formally published their Title IX rule, which includes a number of changes to the Title IX regulations, one of which requires schools to allow transgender students to participate in sports and to use intimate facilities that align with their gender identity, under the theory that failure to do so would be more than a de minimis harm to the student. So, as I mentioned earlier, just this year, right, 9 states have passed protecting women's sports laws that now directly conflict with this proposal. In total, there are 18 states that have state laws that directly conflict with this proposal. It's a difficult situation because last year, almost a year ago, the Biden administration published a notice of interpretation informing the public and schools that they were going to enforce Title IX consistent with this policy, right? Based on gender identity as opposed to biological sex. And so even though these rules have just been proposed, and even though they are still in the process, OCR, the Department of Education, is actively enforcing Title IX to consistent with this policy. So, on one hand, schools they are being truthful when they say the federal government is telling us that this is the policy and that we have to comply with this. That is a truthful statement. But on the other hand, there is this federal rulemaking process that the Biden administration is engaging in to formally codify this policy. So the stage is being set, so to speak, for federal requirements to directly conflict with state law. And, I think that's certainly going to lead to litigation that is far, far down the road. In the meantime, what I would tell parents is that they should continue to engage with state legislators. They should continue to engage with their governors. They should continue to engage with their local school boards. They should continue to engage with their local superintendents. And I think the message has to be, you are our elected officials, and we do not want you accepting this directive from the federal government. We want to elect board members. We want superintendents in place who are going to fairly enforce Title IX in a way that protects all students, and to look for those candidates for their local school boards. But there's no doubt that during this period, we are in a very difficult situation when it comes to Title IX. And as I mentioned, no doubt this will end up in court and being decided by judges.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, last quick question for you guys, and then you can each give your final remarks. But is there anything positive happening for our parents who live in blue states? Is there anything positive happening there for them?
Well, one positive piece of news came not thanks to a blue state legislature, but to the Supreme Court. Carson v. Macon is a seminal case decided a few weeks ago in which the Supreme Court held that if a state provides private school vouchers, it cannot exclude religiously affiliated schools from receiving those vouchers, nor schools that teach religious things or conduct religious activities. And so that's a win for educational pluralism and school choice.
Well, and it's a condemnation of discrimination. I mean, that is really what the case said. And I think that is what the left doesn't want you to realize, is that there was actual discrimination ongoing that this court ruling ruled against. And that's why it was so, that's just so important.
That's right. Well, guys, you've done a fantastic job answering, all of these questions that I've peppered you with. Now, if each of you just want to take, 60 seconds, give a final message to parents. What do they need to do? What do they need to know? John, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. So parents, you need to know that your vote matters and your voice counts. If you want to see the momentum on these important pieces of legislation continue in the next session, that means you have to speak up at your local school boards. You have to go testify at state hearings. The teachers' unions are always present. When the hot button issue comes and goes, they remain, and they are active and vocal in defending their members' interests. And so to counterbalance that, it means that parents have to get organized and get active.
Kimberly?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So along the same lines as what John just mentioned, I would just reiterate to parents that get involved with your state legislators, know your committee education chairs, know your appropriations chairs. As John mentioned, unions, school board groups, superintendents groups have full-time employees who live at the Capitol during legislative session. And it's important that the parental voice is heard throughout the legislative process. And that means engaging with your local legislature, but it also means engaging with other members of your state legislature and with your governor's office and, even with your state board of education. I say all the time that states drive education policy, and our system is structured that way. And what that means is that you have to know how your state process works in order to participate in that process, to make sure that your state has sound educational policies in place that are going to empower parents and protect kids. And so get involved.
And last but not least, Jonathan.
Thank you. Parents have a right to know what their school's policy regarding health and particular gender is. And you can find those policies in either the school board guidebook or the school's student handbook. So you should know how your school is going to treat this issue of whether or not biological males can use a girls' bathroom or a girls' locker room or participate on a girls' sports team. These policies have been adopted for many years, right? Philadelphia, New Jersey, Kansas. It is happening around the country. You have a right to know what your school's policy is. Once you find out, you also have a right to choose how and where your child learns. And many states, even those that don't have education savings accounts, for example, every state has a homeschool law. Most states, nearly all states, have a charter school law. Many states have interdistrict transfer laws, even some that require some sort of application or request. But states like Arizona and Florida today, you can attend virtually any public school in the state subject to space. And there are also private school scholarship opportunities in more than half of all U.S. states around the country. So these options are available to you, and parents should be encouraged to find the best place for their child to learn.
Absolutely. I think one theme here that we've talked about for, the past hour or so is know what's going on locally, know what's going on in your school and, in your, the local government at the state level, really, really inform yourself in those issues, because it would seem that those, matter more. The things, that are closer to home matter more sometimes than what's going on at the federal level. So panelists, thank you so much for joining us. And parents, thank you for joining as well. Just, to let you guys know, you can always submit incident reports on Parents Defending Education's website. We've got tons of information for you there. So check that out and share this video with a friend and tag us. So thanks again.